The Battle of Yelnya in the summer of 1941 cannot be understood without tracing the broader context of the German invasion of the Soviet Union and the unfolding of Operation Barbarossa. On 22 June 1941, three German army groups crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with the most ambitious objective: the destruction of Soviet forces in Belorussia and a rapid advance on Moscow. Within weeks, German panzer groups under Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies in the battles of Minsk and Smolensk, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and advancing hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. The Red Army had been weakened by purges in the late 1930s, which removed thousands of experienced officers, and its performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939-40 revealed severe deficiencies in training, coordination, and equipment. Despite rapid mobilization in June 1941, many Soviet units were understrength, poorly supplied, and lacked coordination between infantry, armor, and air power. Nonetheless, the Soviet state mobilized its enormous human and material resources, drafting millions of reservists and attempting to stabilize the front line west of Moscow. The Yelnya salient emerged directly from the German drive towards Smolensk in July 1941. After the encirclement battle near Smolensk, German forces sought to consolidate their positions. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Group under Guderian and the 4th Army under Günther von Kluge pushed toward the town of Yelnya, located about 80 kilometers southeast of Smolensk. The town lay on a ridge that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain and served as a potential springboard for a renewed advance toward Moscow. By early August 1941, the German 20th Army Corps, including the 137th, 78th, 292nd, and 268th Infantry Divisions, established a fortified salient around Yelnya. Approximately 70,000 German troops occupied the position, supported by artillery and logistical units. For the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, the salient represented both a threat and an opportunity. Its proximity to Moscow raised fears that the Germans could launch a direct offensive eastward once they regrouped. At the same time, the salient's exposed position, jutting into Soviet lines, offered a chance for a counterattack. By late July, the Soviet command sought to organize coordinated strikes to eliminate this foothold. The Western Front, commanded by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, was reinforced with the newly formed Reserve Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, which included fresh rifle divisions raised during the early weeks of the war. The Soviet decision to attack Yelnya reflected both political and military calculations. Politically, Stalin demanded an active defense and sought to demonstrate to the Soviet people and to foreign observers that the Red Army was capable of launching counteroffensives. Militarily, the salient created logistical vulnerabilities for the Germans, whose supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers back to bases in Poland. The Wehrmacht faced shortages of fuel and ammunition, and infantry divisions were already showing signs of exhaustion after 6 weeks of nearly continuous operations. Intelligence estimates on both sides influenced the coming battle. German commanders assessed that the Soviets lacked the capacity to mount sustained offensives in August 1941, underestimating the size of newly mobilized Soviet forces. Soviet intelligence, meanwhile, overestimated the strength of German units in the salient but correctly identified their exposed position. This misalignment of perceptions set the stage for a confrontation in which both sides would commit significant forces under conditions of limited preparation and high risk. Public sentiment reflected the broader atmosphere of uncertainty. In Germany, the initial triumphs of Barbarossa encouraged confidence that the campaign would end quickly, with Moscow expected to fall before winter. German propaganda emphasized rapid victories and massive Soviet losses. In the Soviet Union, the situation was dire but not hopeless. The fall of Smolensk had caused the population around Yelnya itself faced immediate consequences. Villages were destroyed in the fighting, and civilians were caught between two armies, forced into flight or pressed into labor for occupying forces. Thus, by August 1941, the Yelnya salient had become a focal point of the central sector of the Eastern Front. For Germany, it was a potential launchpad toward Moscow, but also a logistical liability. For the Soviet Union, it was a dangerous breach in their defenses, but also a target for demonstrating the capacity of the Red Army to resist and counterattack. The stage was set for one of the first major Soviet offensives of the war, a battle that would test the endurance of both armies in the harsh conditions of the summer of 1941. The opening phase of the Yelnya battle unfolded in early August 1941, when German forces consolidated their hold on the salient after the Smolensk fighting. The 20th Army Corps under General Rudolf Schmidt established a fortified perimeter around Yelnya, extending roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 25 kilometers north to south. The Germans constructed trench systems, dugouts, and artillery positions on the elevated terrain, supported by supply depots in the town itself. The divisions manning the salient, 137th, 78th, 292nd, and 268th Infantry Divisions, were supported by artillery regiments and engineers, totaling about 70,000 men. These units had endured heavy fighting since June and were not at full strength, but they remained well-trained and equipped compared to many of the Soviet formations gathering opposite them. On the Soviet side, Stavka placed responsibility for eliminating the salient on the newly established reserve front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. This front included several armies formed from fresh rifle divisions. The 24th Army, under Major General Konstantin Rakutin, became the primary force assigned to the task. By mid-August, Rakutin commanded around 103,000 men organized into 6 rifle divisions, supported by artillery brigades and tank units. Many of these divisions had been raised hastily and lacked combat experience, but their numerical strength and determination gave them potential for offensive action. Initial Soviet moves in the second week of August focused on reconnaissance and limited attacks to probe German defenses. Soviet rifle regiments attempted to seize outlying villages such as Glinka and Dorogobuj, encountering entrenched German infantry supported by machine guns and mortars. These early clashes exposed the depth of the German fortifications and the difficulty of assaulting well-prepared positions without adequate artillery preparation. Soviet units suffered heavy casualties in frontal attacks. German commanders initially regarded these Soviet efforts as local counterattacks, typical of the Eastern Front in July and August 1941. Reports from the 137th Infantry Division described the Soviet assaults as costly but poorly coordinated, with tanks and infantry often failing to act in unison. However, by the third week of August, German intelligence detected increasing Soviet concentrations, suggesting a larger offensive was imminent. Despite these warnings, the German command decided to hold the salient, valuing its position as a forward base for a future advance toward Moscow once reinforcements arrived. Civilian populations around Yelnya faced immediate consequences from the opening battles. Villages on the edges of the salient were contested repeatedly, with houses destroyed by artillery fire. German forces requisitioned food and livestock to support their garrisons, while Soviet civilians fleeing eastward crowded roads already choked with. The Red Army requisitioned labor from local inhabitants for trench digging and supply work, further straining communities already suffering from shortages. Morale in both armies reflected the conditions of the opening phase. German soldiers, though fatigued from weeks of continuous advance, maintained confidence in their defensive positions and artillery superiority. Soviet troops, many of them new recruits, endured severe losses, but fought with determination under orders that emphasized the political importance of recapturing Yelnya. Commanders reported high casualties, but also noted that replacements were arriving regularly, ensuring that divisions could sustain repeated assaults. By late August, The opening clashes had established the character of the coming battle. The Germans held a compact, fortified salient, aware of its vulnerability, but unwilling to withdraw without orders. The Soviets massed forces for a sustained counteroffensive, determined to deliver a blow that would both disrupt German preparations for Moscow and demonstrate the capacity of the Red Army to go on the attack. The stage was set for large-scale engagements that would test the resilience of both armies in one of the first major Soviet offensive operations of the war. The strategic goals and planning behind the Yelnya operation in August 1941 revealed both the opportunities and the limitations faced by the opposing sides. For the German command, the Yelnya salient was initially a byproduct of the rapid advance during Operation Barbarossa. After the Battle of Smolensk in July, elements of the 2nd Panzer Group had pushed southeast to expand control of the approaches to Moscow. Once the armored spearheads were withdrawn for further operations, infantry divisions of the 20th Army Corps were left to hold the salient. From a German perspective, the position offered a forward base for artillery and potential springboard for further advances, but it also created a protruding front line vulnerable to encirclement. Nevertheless, the Oberkommando des Heer, OKH, considered the salient worth holding, both for prestige and for its potential operational value, once new offensives resumed in September. German planning for Yelnya emphasized consolidation rather than expansion. Defensive positions were systematically organized, with trenches, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements dug into the ridge. Supply lines stretched westward through Smolensk, already burdened by the logistical strain of Barbarossa. German infantry divisions in the salient reported shortages of replacements and equipment, but command insisted on maintaining the position. The intention was to hold until Army Group Center regrouped for the next phase of the Moscow offensive, which Adolf Hitler and the OKH hoped would commence by mid-September. For the Soviet High Command, the Yelnya salient became an attractive target for one of the first organized counteroffensives of the war. By early August, Stavka recognized that the German advance, though still formidable, had slowed after the heavy battles at Smolensk. Supply lines for the Wehrmacht were stretched to breaking point, while German infantry had endured nearly 2 months of constant campaigning. Georgy Zhukov, newly placed in command of the reserve front, argued that striking the Yelnya position would not only improve the defensive line, but also prove to Soviet soldiers and citizens that the Red Army was capable of offensive action. The objectives of the Soviet counteroffensive were twofold. Operationally, it aimed to eliminate the German salient, straighten the front, and reduce the immediate threat to Moscow's southern approaches. Politically, it aimed to provide a morale boost at a time when news from the front was dominated by Soviet defeats and massive losses. Stalin pressed Stavka for tangible results, and the recapture of Yelnya promised both strategic and symbolic value. Preparations for the Soviet attack involved the 24th Army under Major General Konstantin Rakutin, supported by adjacent formations from the 43rd and 49th Armies. By late August, the 24th Army comprised about 103,000 men, 146 tanks, and several artillery brigades. These forces were organized into 6 rifle divisions and 1 tank brigade, most of which were newly formed. Many soldiers lacked combat experience, and the tank units were equipped largely with older T-26 and BT-7 models, with only limited numbers of the newer T-34. Artillery strength, however, was considerable, with massed batteries intended to soften German positions before the infantry assault. Logistics posed a serious challenge for the Soviets. Rail lines to the front were overloaded, and shortages of trucks slowed the delivery of ammunition and supplies. Nevertheless, Stavka prioritized the Yelnya operation, diverting resources to ensure that the 24th Army had sufficient artillery shells and reserves of manpower. Propaganda units were also dispatched to prepare troops and to emphasize the importance of their mission. Newspapers and broadcasts described the coming operation as a chance to strike back against the invader. German intelligence underestimated the scale of the Soviet preparations. Reports from reconnaissance flights and patrols noted increased Soviet activity, but the prevailing assessment was that German doctrine assumed that entrenched infantry divisions could hold against superior numbers, especially given their defensive preparations and artillery support. This assumption led the 20th Army Corps to commit fully to holding the salient, despite its exposed position. The propaganda dimension of the planning was notable. In Moscow, the Soviet government emphasized the counteroffensive as a signal of resilience. For the first time since June, Soviet announcements promised not only defense, but also attack. Among German troops, propaganda portrayed the salient as a firm bastion, a symbol of German strength on the way to Moscow. Both sides therefore attached political significance to the outcome, ensuring that the battle would be more than a local tactical engagement. By the end of August 1941, both armies had completed their preparations. The Germans fortified their positions with interlocking fields of fire and artillery support, determined to hold the salient until ordered otherwise. The Soviets massed divisions for an assault that would test their ability to coordinate combined arms under intense fire. The stage was set for one of the first major Soviet counteroffensives of the war, where planning, logistics, and political will converged in the attempt to retake Yelnya. The first engagements of the Yelnya counteroffensive began in the final days of August 1941, when the Soviet 24th Army launched its assault against the German-held salient. The battle marked one of the earliest large-scale Soviet offensives of the war, and its opening clashes revealed both the determination of the Red Army and the formidable resistance of the Wehrmacht. On 30th August, after a concentrated artillery bombardment, Soviet rifle divisions advanced on the flanks of the salient. The 102nd and 106th Rifle Divisions struck near the villages of Slobodka and Novaya Berezovka, while the 107th and 100th Rifle Divisions advanced against positions closer to Yelnya itself. Artillery fire disrupted some German strongpoints, but the defensive works of the 20th Army Corps proved resilient. German infantry, dug into trenches with overlapping fields of fire, used mortars and machine guns to inflict heavy casualties on the attacking Soviets. The first waves of Soviet troops often advanced without sufficient coordination with armor, and the light T-26 and BT-7 tanks struggled to cross fields torn up by artillery craters. Despite losses, Soviet forces pressed forward. By 31st August, the 24th Army captured several forward German positions, including parts of the defensive line east of Yelnya. These gains came at a high price. Some rifle regiments reported casualty rates of 30 to 40% in the opening days. German reports described the Soviet assaults as massive and continuous, noting that even after repelling one wave, another soon followed. This persistence forced the Germans to commit their reserves earlier than planned, straining divisions that were already under strength from weeks of campaigning. Civilians in the contested zone experienced devastation as the battle unfolded. Villages along the salient were caught in crossfire or deliberately destroyed to deny shelter to the enemy. Civilians who had remained during the German occupation were often pressed into labor, repairing trenches or carrying supplies. As Soviet forces advanced, many were evacuated eastward, joining columns of refugees moving along muddy roads under artillery fire. Accounts from both sides indicate that local populations endured widespread shortages of food and shelter during the fighting. Morale contrasted sharply between the two armies. German infantrymen, though exhausted, retained confidence in their defensive system. Divisional diaries recorded that officers emphasized discipline and the superiority of German firepower. Yet complaints of fatigue and lack of replacements also appeared, with units noting that companies had been reduced to half their authorized strength. Soviet troops, despite inexperience and heavy losses, fought with determination under orders from Stavka that emphasized the political and military necessity of retaking Yelnya. Commissars and officers urged soldiers forward with appeals to patriotism and survival, reinforcing discipline in newly raised formations. The Luftwaffe and Soviet Air Force also clashed over the salient. German Ju-87 dive bombers and He-111 bombers targeted Soviet artillery positions and assembly areas, while Soviet Il-2s and fighters, both sides suffered losses, but the Luftwaffe retained a qualitative edge in coordination, even if numerical superiority was less pronounced than in June or July. For Soviet ground troops, German air attacks added to the difficulty of sustaining momentum, while German infantry increasingly faced harassment from Soviet aircraft, signaling the Red Army's growing willingness to commit air assets to offensive operations. The first days of fighting also exposed weaknesses in Soviet command coordination. Communications between rifle divisions and supporting tank brigades were often disrupted, leading to piecemeal assaults that the Germans could repel in detail. Artillery preparation sometimes fell short of expectations, leaving German machine gun nests intact. Yet Soviet commanders adapted quickly, shifting their focus to encircling smaller German positions rather than frontal assaults against the strongest defenses. By 2nd September, Soviet forces had penetrated deeper into the flanks of the salient, creating pressure that threatened to cut off German units closer to Yelnya itself. German responses grew increasingly desperate as Soviet attacks intensified. The 137th and 78th Infantry Divisions bore the brunt of the fighting, reporting hundreds of casualties each day. Requests for reinforcements and ammunition became urgent, but Army Group Center was already stretched thin by ongoing operations elsewhere. Supplies reached the salient irregularly, and medical facilities were overwhelmed. German commanders recognized that holding Yelnya indefinitely would require disproportionate resources compared to its strategic value. By 3rd September, the character of the battle was clear. The Soviets had demonstrated their capacity to mount sustained offensive action, albeit with very high casualties. The Germans, while still holding key positions, found their lines under continuous pressure and their divisions steadily worn down. The first engagements around Yelnya did not produce immediate breakthroughs, but they set the conditions for escalation. Both armies recognized that the battle was far from over and that the next phase would determine whether the salient could be held or eliminated. Thus, the initial clashes of late August and early September 1941 represented more than just local engagements. They marked the beginning of a full-scale Soviet counteroffensive, an operation that tested the endurance of inexperienced divisions against entrenched German veterans, and that would soon escalate into one of the most brutal confrontations of the early Eastern Front. The escalation of the fighting at Yelnya came in the first week of September 1941, when the Soviet 24th Army committed all available forces to intensify the offensive. After initial probing and costly assaults, Stavka ordered Rakutin to sustain pressure along the entire perimeter of the salient. The goal was no longer limited to weakening German defenses, but to break through and force the 20th Army Corps to withdraw. This directive coincided with continued mobilization across the Soviet Union, ensuring a steady flow of replacements to fill gaps in rifle divisions despite enormous casualties. On 4th or 5 September, Soviet artillery units concentrated unprecedented fire against the flanks of the salient. Entire batteries of 122 mm and 152 mm howitzers pounded German trenches and strongpoints for hours before infantry advanced. The Red Army had learned from earlier failures and began employing more coordinated barrages, attempting to suppress machine guns and artillery before infantry closed in. German accounts describe the ground shaking. Yet when Soviet rifle regiments surged forward, they still encountered pockets of resistance where German units had survived underground shelters. The German command, led by General Rudolf Schmidt of the 20th Corps, faced mounting difficulties. By early September, the divisions holding Yelnya were severely depleted. The 137th Infantry Division, for example, reported fewer than 6,000 combat-ready troops, half its nominal strength. Ammunition expenditure had outpaced supply, and the road network leading to Yelnya was clogged with mud from late summer rains, hampering deliveries. Reinforcements promised from Army Group Center were delayed, as priority went to preparations for the larger offensive toward Moscow. Despite these obstacles, orders from higher command emphasized holding the salient as long as possible, maintaining a forward presence east of Smolensk. For the Soviets, morale rose even as losses mounted. Propaganda units highlighted the battle as proof that German forces could be driven back. Reports from the 100th and 107th Rifle Divisions describe soldiers pressing assaults under continuous fire, sometimes advancing only a few hundred meters at great cost. Tank brigades, though equipped with obsolete T-26 and BT-7s, operated in small groups to support infantry in close engagements, focusing on isolated German strongpoints rather than massed frontal attacks. This adaptation allowed the Soviets to capture several villages along the salient's southern edge, tightening the encirclement. Civilian suffering intensified during the escalation. Villages such as Glinka and Dorogobuj were reduced to ruins by artillery exchanges. German units evacuated civilians from some areas to clear fields of fire, while Soviet forces moved inhabitants eastward to avoid reprisals. Refugee columns of women, children, and elderly people traversed roads littered with wreckage, often under threat from air attacks. The logistical burden of feeding and sheltering displaced populations strained Soviet rear area administrations, yet many civilians volunteered to support the Red Army with labor and reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe attempted to relieve pressure with concentrated airstrikes. On 6 September, formations of U-87 Stukas targeted Soviet artillery batteries and supply convoys, inflicting heavy damage. However, Soviet fighter coverage, though limited, was increasingly present, and anti-aircraft guns near Murmanskaya and Arkhangelskoye villages claimed several German aircraft. The balance of air power remained in Germany's favor, but the Soviets demonstrated a growing ability to contest the skies, complicating Luftwaffe operations. By 7th or 8th September, the cumulative effect of Soviet assaults, multiple regiments of the 292nd Infantry Division were pulled back from advanced positions after suffering severe casualties. Soviet penetrations on the southern and northern flanks threatened to cut off units still holding the center of the salient. German commanders reported battalion strengths reduced to fewer than 300 men, with many companies down to 60-80. Soviet estimates suggested that the Germans were beginning to consider withdrawal, though Hitler's insistence on holding ground delayed such decisions. Escalation at Yelnya also carried wider political implications. In Moscow, Stalin received reports daily from Zhukov, who stressed that the offensive was wearing down German divisions and boosting Soviet morale. Pravda and other newspapers began cautiously reporting counterattacks in the Smolensk sector, contrasting them with earlier defeats. For the first time since June 1941, the Soviet public heard of German positions being abandoned under pressure. The crisis stage of the Yelnya battle thus reflected the exhaustion of German defenders and the growing determination of Soviet attackers. The Soviets had not yet achieved a decisive breakthrough, but their relentless pressure eroded German capacity to hold the salient. What had begun as local probing had escalated into a full-scale offensive that drained both armies. By mid-September, the outcome would hinge on whether German units could maintain cohesion or whether the Red Army could force the first significant German withdrawal of the war. The peak of the Yelnya battle came in the second week of September 1941, when both sides committed their full strength and the fighting reached its most destructive intensity. After days of costly probing, The Soviet 24th Army concentrated its divisions for sustained assaults across multiple sectors of the salient. Marshal Zhukov, overseeing the operation from the Reserve Front headquarters, pressed Rakutin to deliver a decisive blow that would collapse the German position. On 8th or 10th September, Soviet artillery fired tens of thousands of shells in preparation barrages, softening defensive lines before infantry and tanks advanced. The German 20th Army Corps, still holding the salient, faced the heaviest pressure since the start of the operation. The 137th and 78th Infantry Divisions, manning the southern approaches, absorbed repeated Soviet attacks supported by armor. Battalion after battalion reported catastrophic losses. Companies reduced to fewer than 50 men, artillery regiments short of ammunition, and medical units overwhelmed with casualties. The 292nd Infantry Division, positioned closer to Yelnya itself, was forced to abandon several fortified villages under Soviet pressure, conducting fighting withdrawals to secondary lines. Despite these setbacks, German units fought with discipline, using machine guns, mortars, and local counterattacks to slow Soviet progress. For the Soviets, this phase of the battle was defined by relentless commitment. Divisions like the 100th, 106th, and 107th Rifle Divisions sustained casualties exceeding 50%, but continued to advance in successive waves. Soviet commanders adapted their tactics. Rather than frontal charges alone, they employed flanking maneuvers and infiltration through wooded areas. Tank brigades, though still composed largely of light models vulnerable to German anti-tank guns, worked in small detachments to suppress machine gun nests and break wire obstacles. Artillery coordination improved, with concentrated barrages directly preceding infantry assaults, reducing German ability to repel. Accounts from survivors indicate that many inhabitants had no choice but to flee eastward, abandoning homes and livestock. Some civilians remained in shelters or cellars, often forced by German units to assist in constructing defenses, while others provided intelligence to advancing Soviet troops. The destruction of villages around the salient left much of the countryside devastated, with burned fields and shattered infrastructure. Air operations also intensified. The Luftwaffe deployed Ju-87 dive bombers and medium bombers in concentrated strikes against Soviet supply lines and troop concentrations. Soviet aircraft, though fewer in number, increasingly challenged these raids, and Soviet anti-aircraft guns around the 24th Army's artillery positions claimed a growing tally of German planes. Control of the skies remained The peak battles culminated on 10 to 11 September, when Soviet attacks forced the Germans to yield key defensive positions. Reports from German Corps headquarters acknowledged that divisions were exhausted and incapable of sustaining prolonged resistance without reinforcement. Soviet penetrations on both flanks of the salient narrowed the corridor of supply to Yelnya, threatening encirclement. German commanders urged withdrawal to avoid destruction, but higher command hesitated, reluctant to concede ground after months of continuous advance. By mid-September, however, the intensity of Soviet pressure left little choice. The Yelnya salient, once conceived as a forward base, had become a liability. German divisions were drained of manpower and supplies, while Soviet forces, though bloodied, remained capable of launching fresh assaults. The battle reached its climax in brutal close combat across villages and ridges, where Soviet troops slowly pushed the defenders back. The fighting demonstrated both the resilience of German defensive doctrine and the growing capacity of the Red Army to organize and sustain offensive operations. This phase marked the high point of violence and attrition in the Yelnya counteroffensive. Losses on both sides were immense, but the cumulative effect of Soviet persistence and German exhaustion prepared the ground for the first significant German withdrawal of the war. The outcome of these peak battles would resonate beyond the local front, influencing both the strategic situation in the central sector and the morale of armies and populations alike. Resistance and adaptation defined the latter stages of the Yelnya counteroffensive, as both the Soviet and German commands sought to adjust to the grinding demands of the battle. By mid-September 1941, the German 20th Army Corps was fighting at the limits of endurance. Divisions that had begun the campaign in June with full strength now fielded only fragments of their original numbers. The 137th Infantry Division, for instance, reported fewer than 5,000 combat-ready men, while the 78th Division held lines with reduced battalions numbering scarcely 200 soldiers each. Despite this, German units continued to mount local counterattacks, seeking to buy time and maintain cohesion until a withdrawal could be sanctioned. German adaptation at Yelnya took the form of tactical flexibility. Infantry regiments conducted fighting retreats to successive prepared positions, attempting to inflict maximum casualties before yielding ground. Engineers mined approaches to villages and rigged bridges for demolition. Mortar and artillery units, though low on ammunition, shifted positions frequently to avoid Soviet counter-battery fire. The Luftwaffe, with diminished resources, flew targeted sorties against Soviet supply depots and road junctions, slowing the flow of reinforcements to the front. These measures did not reverse the overall tide, but allowed the Germans to prevent immediate collapse. For the Red Army, resistance and adaptation meant overcoming the enormous losses sustained in earlier assaults and finding ways to maintain momentum. Rifle divisions were reinforced with reserves drawn from newly mobilized units in the interior, though these replacements often arrived with minimal training. Commanders increasingly emphasized combined arms tactics, coordinating artillery barrages, infantry assaults, and tank support in ways that reduced unnecessary expenditure of manpower. Units such as the 100th Rifle Division, despite suffering 60% casualties, adapted by reorganizing companies and battalions on the spot, merging depleted units to keep formations operational. The psychological toll of the battle was immense on both sides. German soldiers, after weeks of attrition, recorded in diaries and reports their exhaustion and disbelief at the scale of Soviet resistance. What had been anticipated as another step toward Moscow had instead become a costly defensive struggle. Soviet troops, for their part, were under constant pressure from commissars and commanders to continue attacking, even after suffering staggering casualties. Yet morale within the Soviet ranks improved as reports confirmed German withdrawals from forward positions. For many Red Army soldiers, the sight of enemy trenches abandoned under pressure was the first tangible sign that the Wehrmacht could be forced to retreat. Adaptation extended to the logistical sphere. The Soviets improved their supply organization during the battle, prioritizing artillery shells and medical supplies for the 24th Army. Makeshift hospitals were established near the front, treating thousands of wounded daily, while field kitchens and supply depots worked to sustain units with minimal interruption. German supply efforts, conversely, grew more precarious. Roads leading into Yelnya were under constant Soviet artillery fire, and convoys struggled to deliver fuel and rations. Horses, critical to German transport, died in large numbers from exhaustion and shelling, further straining mobility. Civilian populations also demonstrated resilience and adaptation. Many villagers in contested zones evacuated eastward, but those who remained often assisted Soviet troops with intelligence on German positions or by providing food and shelter. Others, caught in German-held areas, endured forced labor and requisitioning. The destruction of farmland and infrastructure created long-term hardship, but the immediate priority for civilians was survival amid artillery fire and shifting front lines. By 12 to 13 September, the momentum of the Soviet offensive was undeniable. German units continued to resist fiercely, but were no longer able to hold the entire salient. The adaptation strategies of the Red Army, repeated assaults, coordination of artillery and infantry, and relentless application of manpower, gradually overcame German defenses. The Germans, adapting in their own way, focused on delaying actions and controlled withdrawals, seeking to avoid encirclement. The resistance and adaptation displayed by both armies at Yelnya encapsulated the broader character of the Eastern Front in 1941. The Wehrmacht, still tactically proficient, struggled with overstretched supply lines and exhaustion. This dynamic prepared the ground for the critical turning point of the battle, the decision by German High Command to authorize withdrawal from the Yelnya salient, conceding for the first time ground gained during Barbarossa. The turning point of the Yelnya battle came in the middle of September 1941, when the cumulative effect of Soviet assaults and German exhaustion compelled a fundamental shift in the course of the fighting. By 12-13 September, reports from the 20th Army Corps painted a dire picture. The 137th, 78th, and 292nd Infantry Divisions had been reduced to fragments of their original strength. German battalions that had numbered 700-800 men in June now counted 150-200 effectives. Ammunition stocks were nearly depleted, and medical units reported thousands of wounded with inadequate facilities for treatment. German commanders repeatedly warned higher headquarters that the salient could not be held without risking encirclement. On 14 September, after days of debate, Army Group Center authorized withdrawal from the Yelnya salient. This decision marked the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa that German forces were ordered to abandon a position seized during the advance. The withdrawal was to be conducted in stages, with rearguard actions covering the evacuation of heavy equipment and wounded. Engineers destroyed bridges, rail lines, and ammunition dumps to deny resources to the Soviets. Infantry units pulled back under the cover of artillery fire, retreating to more defensible positions west of Yelnya. For the Soviets, the German withdrawal signaled both opportunity and challenge. The 24th Army, under Rakutin, was ordered to press forward and exploit the retreat. Soviet divisions advanced cautiously at first, wary of counterattacks, but soon occupied abandoned German trenches and villages. By 15-16 September, Red Army troops entered Yelnya itself, raising Soviet flags over a town that had been under German control for more than a month. Reports from the front emphasized the symbolic importance of this victory, highlighting it as the first major liberation of Soviet territory since the start of the war. The breakthrough at Yelnya carried operational significance. The elimination of the salient straightened the Soviet defensive line and removed a potential springboard for the German advance toward Moscow from the south. It also inflicted serious losses on 4 German infantry divisions, which would not recover their full strength before the launch of Operation Typhoon in October. The Soviet ability to mount and sustain an offensive demonstrated that the Red Army was not limited to defensive actions, altering the psychological balance on the Central Front. For German soldiers, the retreat was a bitter experience. Diaries and reports from the 20th Corps describe feelings of fatigue, frustration, and disbelief that withdrawal had been ordered. Many had believed the salient would be held at any cost, and the concession of ground ran contrary to the momentum of Barbarossa. For Soviet troops, by contrast, the sight of German forces retreating under pressure offered the first tangible evidence that the Wehrmacht could be forced back. The turning point at Yelnya therefore represented more than a tactical adjustment. It was the culmination of weeks of attrition that had drained German divisions and demonstrated the Soviet capacity to adapt and persevere. It shifted perceptions on both sides, introducing the possibility that the German advance was not unstoppable and that Soviet counteroffensives could achieve tangible results. The consequences of this decision. The aftermath of the Yelnya battle unfolded rapidly in the second half of September 1941. Once German forces completed their withdrawal from the salient, Soviet troops moved in to consolidate the area. The 24th Army occupied Yelnya and surrounding villages by 16-17 September, finding the town heavily damaged by shelling and deliberate German demolitions. Bridges had been destroyed, fields burned, and stockpiles of supplies rendered unusable. The Red Army quickly began repairing infrastructure to stabilize the front, while Soviet engineers cleared mines and unexploded ordnance left behind in large quantities. Casualties revealed the cost of the operation. German records indicate that the 4 divisions of the 20th Army Corps lost around 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the Yelnya fighting. Many battalions were reduced to skeletal strength, and the divisions required months of rest and refitting before they could participate in major operations. Soviet losses were even higher. The 24th Army alone suffered more than 40,000 casualties, with several rifle divisions losing over half of their personnel. The Soviet command replaced these losses with new conscripts, but the scale of attrition reflected the immense human cost of forcing the German retreat. The withdrawal from Yelnya had immediate operational consequences. For the Wehrmacht, abandoning the salient meant conceding a position intended as a base for further operations toward Moscow. Army Group Center now held a shorter and more defensible line, but the divisions involved were exhausted and weakened. The setback delayed preparations for Operation Typhoon, the planned offensive against Moscow, forcing the Germans to reorganize their forces in late September. For the Soviets, the capture of Yelnya improved their defensive posture in the central sector. Civilians in the Yelnya region returned to scenes of devastation. Villages had been destroyed by artillery, livestock confiscated, and food supplies exhausted. Many houses were burned during the retreat, leaving inhabitants without shelter as autumn set in. Soviet authorities organized emergency aid and began re-establishing local administration, but the population faced severe hardship. German reprisals during the retreat had also taken a toll, with reports of executions of suspected partisans and the forced evacuation of able-bodied men for labor. The humanitarian crisis in the area mirrored the devastation occurring along much of the Eastern Front. Politically, the aftermath of Yelnya carried symbolic weight. In Moscow, the victory was presented as the first successful offensive operation of the war. Pravda and Izvestia hailed the liberation of Yelnya as proof that the Red Army could not only defend, but also attack and win back territory. The battle became an important propaganda tool, boosting morale at a time when German forces still occupied vast areas of Soviet territory. For the German public, the withdrawal was minimized in official communications, portrayed as a tactical adjustment rather than a defeat. For the soldiers on both sides, the aftermath brought exhaustion and reflection. German units withdrew westward to rest and refit, many soldiers writing in diaries of relief at leaving the killing fields of Yelnya behind. Soviet troops celebrated their success, but faced the grim task of reorganizing shattered divisions and absorbing new recruits. The cost of victory was evident in the empty ranks and improvised graves scattered across the battlefield. In the immediate aftermath, the Yelnya operation stood as a rare Soviet success in the otherwise bleak summer of 1941. It did not reverse the overall strategic situation. German forces still controlled vast swathes of Soviet territory and prepared for a renewed drive on Moscow. Yet the consequences of the battle were clear. The Wehrmacht had suffered its first ordered withdrawal of the campaign, while the Red Army had proven its ability to conduct offensive operations despite immense losses. The stage was set for the next phase, as both sides prepared for the decisive battles that would follow in the autumn. The legacy of the Battle of Yelnya extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, shaping both the historical memory of 1941 and the broader understanding of the Eastern Front. In strictly military terms, the battle represented the first time that German forces were compelled to retreat from a position captured during Operation Barbarossa. The withdrawal from the Yelnya salient, authorized in mid-September, demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, and that the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses elsewhere, could mount organized counteroffensives. This realization influenced later Soviet planning and morale, showing that with sufficient concentration of men and artillery, the enemy could be forced back. For Germany, the battle revealed the vulnerability of extended salients and the risks of overextension. 4 divisions of the 20th Army Corps were severely weakened, with estimates of 20,000–23,000 casualties. These losses had direct implications for Operation Typhoon, launched in October 1941, as weakened divisions were less effective in the advance toward Moscow. German High Command began to reassess the value of maintaining exposed forward positions, though Hitler continued to insist on holding ground wherever possible. The Soviet Union incorporated Yelnya into its war. Soviet newspapers hailed the liberation of the town as a turning point, the first great victory of the Red Army in the war. It was during and after this battle that the Soviet leadership publicly recognized the Guards' formations. Several divisions that distinguished themselves at Yelnya, including the 100th Rifle Division, were redesignated as Guards units, establishing a tradition that would mark elite Soviet formations throughout the war. This designation served both as recognition of battlefield performance and as a motivational tool, symbolizing the emergence of new standards of discipline and combat effectiveness. Culturally, Yelnya became a reference point in Soviet collective memory. Veterans of the battle recalled it as a formative moment when poorly trained divisions transformed under fire into effective fighting units. Memorials erected in Yelnya and surrounding villages after the war emphasized the sacrifice of tens of thousands of soldiers who fought and died to reclaim the salient. Annual commemorations linked the battle to the eventual Soviet victory, presenting it as an early proof that the German advance could be halted. In Western historiography, Yelnya has often been overshadowed by larger operations, such as the defense of Moscow or the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. Yet military historians recognize its significance as an early demonstration of Soviet offensive capability. It marked the transition from uncoordinated counterattacks of June and July to more deliberate, large-scale operations. The destruction of villages, displacement of civilians, and high military casualties turned Yelnya into a symbol of the war's devastation. Local populations suffered through the winter with limited food and shelter, even after the town was retaken. The ruins of Yelnya served as a reminder of the cost of both occupation and liberation, underscoring the wider civilian suffering that defined the Eastern Front. In historical debates, Yelnya occupies a complex place. Some analysts emphasize that the Soviet offensive was costly, with more than 40,000 Soviet casualties for limited territorial gain. Others stress that the symbolic and psychological importance outweighed the material losses, since it provided a rare victory at a time of almost constant retreat. Regardless of interpretation, there is agreement that Yelnya marked a shift. The Red Army proved it could not only defend, but also launch effective offensives. Ultimately, the legacy of Yelnya lies in its role as the first clear Soviet counteroffensive success of the Second World War. It foreshadowed the long and costly struggle that would eventually drive the German army back across Eastern Europe. For Germany, it was an early warning that the campaign in the East would not be the short, decisive war that had been promised. For the Soviet Union, it was proof that resistance could evolve into counterattack, and counterattack into victory. The memory of Yelnya thus endures as both a historical milestone and a symbol of transformation during the most critical months of the conflict.